So you just think about that. All right, boys and girls. I do believe it's about time to begin, according to the clock on the wall back there. In fact, it's about 3 minutes past. My goodness. Well, I'm so glad to see everybody here tonight. And for those of you who are tuning in online, thanks a whole bunch for coming our way. We're glad that you're tuning in. We hope that you'll tune in every time that you can. We're here every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. And we are starting a new quarter, of course, today. And that is going to be the book of Numbers. I panicked a little today. It was about 1:30. It was about 1:30, and I got the text from the church. You know, the reminder that the new quarter starts today. I was all geared up for my continuing series on introducing God. And I go, oh, tonight, I thought it was next Wednesday that we were starting the new quarter. And so I threw off everything on my desk that I was working on, and I grabbed a bunch of resources on the book of Numbers and started frantically preparing, and then went home at 4 for our Wednesday night Chick-fil-A date and said, honey, we got to go. I'm really kind of in a crunch. And so we ran down there real quick, and I ran back to the church. So I've got enough material to get us through the first 5 minutes of class. And y'all can talk about the rest. But yeah, I don't know why I thought it was next Wednesday. But I enjoyed, I kind of wish we could have continued on with introducing God, but we're going to continue on with Proverbs on Sunday. And so I didn't want to continue on with both of them for the new quarter. So I wanted to do something, and I can't even remember the time. I'm sure sometime in my 32-year ministry, I have done a study, maybe, on the book of Numbers. I don't remember, to be real honest with you. It's kind of like I never had done a sermon series on the book of Ecclesiastes until I started that earlier this year. And so this has been one of those books that I haven't spent a great deal of time in the classroom on. Had a grad class on Numbers years ago, I think in 1992. In fact, I know it was 1992 because here is the notebook from that class from 1992. Dr. Coy Roper. And so I was looking at my notes that we had to turn in a notebook. And so I thought, I will look at my notes. They were awful. They were absolutely awful. They helped me not one bit. And so I said, well, that ain't going to work, but I can use the actual notebook itself. I need to put my notes in it. So anyway. All right, well, let's talk about the book of Numbers here. And, of course, we are talking about one of the books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. And, you know, the Pentateuch is so important, so critically important. It's really the heart of the entire Old Testament. It is the foundation for everything else in the Old Testament. As you read the prophets are calling people back to the law. That is, they're calling people back to the Pentateuch. The prophets don't bring new law. The law has been delivered. It's been delivered in the Pentateuch, and they are simply concerned about that law. The Psalms, if you read the Psalms, so much tribute is paid to the law. The Proverbs assume the existence of the law, as we've been going through the book of Proverbs, and that righteous people will keep the law. And so everything really centers on the Pentateuch. And, you know, we start reading. The Pentateuch is just great fun to start reading. Everybody loves to start reading. I mean, Genesis 1:1, and you just start with, and you're reading about origins, and you're fired up and wired up. You're going to read all through the Bible, and there is just so much joy that you're experiencing as you're reading through the book of Genesis, and all of the great characters and all of the great patriarchs there. And then, as people say, you get through the book of Genesis, and soon you get exhausted in Exodus, and you get lost in Leviticus, and you get numb in Numbers, and then you're finally done in Deuteronomy. That's usually how it goes. And people go, okay, I think I'm going back to the New Testament now. And so they go back to the New Testament, and they decide that they're going to spend very little time in the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, except for the book of Genesis. And that's how it usually or oftentimes works. But that really is unfortunate because, when you have a good grasp of the Pentateuch, there is, you fully begin to understand so many concepts in the rest of the Bible. Because whether you're talking about atonement and blood sacrifice, holiness, election, righteousness, all of these things find their origin in the Old Testament, especially there in the book in the Pentateuch, rather. So the book of Numbers, as part of the Pentateuch, is a very, very important part of the Old Testament. It is a combination. There's a lot of legislation in it. Don't worry, we're not going to get bogged down in that. But even though there's a lot of legislation in it, it's primarily historical narrative. And when we talk about historical narrative, what part of history does the book of Numbers really emphasize and focus on? What? I thought I heard somebody. Yeah. It's really all about that period of time when the children of Israel leave Sinai and they're making their way to the Jordan River, to the Promised Land. Yeah, it's a journey that should have taken about 2 weeks. But it took a lot longer than that. And that is really the central focus in terms of the narrative section of the book of Numbers. And so it is a history that is really marred in sinfulness, but I don't want us, and that's one of the major lessons we're talking about. There's so many relevant lessons that we're going to see as we work our way through the book of Numbers. And the importance of obedience and faithfulness and allegiance to God, all of that is so central in it. But if I had to peg a theme that really trumped everything in the book of Numbers, it is the theme of grace. It is about God's grace. And all of those other things are there, and that's what magnifies the grace of God so much. But it is about God's grace. God has the absolute right to reject his people. But he continues to be faithful to the covenant. And he is continuing to hold out because of his grace. Now, again, there's so many other lessons that we're going to see, like you can't sin without consequences. Absolutely. Or that, God doesn't give us what we deserve, and that's, of course, an extension of grace. It shows that God's promises will always be fulfilled. There's just a lot of things, but as we, again, work our way through, you're going to really see the emphasis on grace. Some of the great, fascinating stories that you'll find in the Bible, you'll find in the book of Numbers. The rebellion of Korah, that's in the book of Numbers. The Balaam's attempt to curse the Israelites, of course, that's found in the book of Numbers. The story of the fiery serpents, that's in the book of Numbers. Some unusual legislation pops up in the book of Numbers, legislation about, the ordeals of jealousy. We'll look at some of those things, the Nazirite vow, and all of those things you'll find in the book of Numbers. And so we're gonna be refamiliarizing ourselves with a lot of very powerful and memorable biblical narrative in Bible stories. As far as the name of the book goes, let me tell you about the name of the book. We call it Numbers. That really comes from the fact that when the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, and the name of that copy of the Scriptures is called the Septuagint. You've heard me mention that before. Because there came a period of time about 300 years before Christ that a lot of Jews they no longer could speak Hebrew, and so the Scriptures were translated into Greek, and the name of the book there in the Septuagint is arithmoi. Now, what do you think? What does that sound like, arithmoi? Yeah, arithmetic. That's exactly what it sounds like, and that's exactly really what it is. And then when it was translated down into the Latin, it became numeri, and then, of course, into English, numbers. If you look in a Hebrew Bible, I've got a Jewish Bible in my office. It's in English, but the name of the book in the Jewish Bible is In the Desert. That's the name of the book. Bamidbar is what they call it, because in the ancient Near East, a lot of times books were named according to the first significant word of the book. Like Genesis in Hebrew, the name of the book is Bereshit, which means in the beginnings. And so, as you look at the book of Numbers, one of the first things that's mentioned is in the desert. It's about the desert wanderings, and so that's where the name of the book comes from. Let's talk a little bit, though, as we do a little background work now, about authorship. Authorship. Who wrote the book of Numbers? Moses. Moses wrote the book of Numbers. I absolutely believe he wrote the book of Numbers. That actually, though, it's interesting. There's, in the world of scholarship, there's a lot of discussion about that. Now, for the first 1,800 years of Christian history, there wasn't much discussion about it at all. And Jewish history. And so, Jewish history, the majority of Christian history, the consensus, there were very few doubts about Mosaic authorship of the whole Pentateuch, including the book of Numbers. But in the early 19th century, some movements came along that began to question Mosaic authorship. And so those discussions are still going on. Let me tell you why and kind of summarize why there's some questions that some people have about it. Let me give you, first of all, the evidence that supports the idea, the historical belief that Moses is the author of it. And I'm going to just start with a biggie, the big piece of evidence. A big piece of evidence is that, turn over, if you will, to Mark chapter 10. A big piece of evidence is that Jesus affirmed it. All right, that's enough for me. If you look at Mark chapter 10, you'll see a couple of places here. Mark chapter 10, look down at about verse 4 and 5. They said, as Jesus is talking about divorce here, they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. See, Moses permitted this. And so, because Jesus answered there in verse 3, when they were asking, some of the Pharisees came up to Jesus and asked if it was lawful for a man to divorce his wife. Jesus said, well, what did Moses command? And they said, well, Moses said, write her a certificate of divorce and send her away. And Jesus said, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this command. And so, you see statements like that where Jesus attributes the law to Moses. Look at Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24. And of course, the Pharisees, as they're talking to Jesus there, like I said, the Jewish perspective has always been Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. Look at Luke chapter 24. Look down at about verse 44. 24:44. Now he said to them, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. And so Jesus is saying all the Old Testament writings have to be fulfilled, and he puts them in three categories. And the first category is a reference to the Pentateuch, and he calls it the law of Moses. This is from Moses. And so Jesus affirms that Moses wrote these. But look at one more. John chapter 5. John chapter 5. And look down to about verse 46. John chapter 5, verse 46. Jesus said, for if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? And so, again, Jesus affirms in multiple places that Moses wrote these books. So that's that's the reason that before, last couple of hundred years ago, there really has not been too much of a, question about the authorship there. Also, the very fact that Moses was certainly qualified to do it. Turn to the book of Acts, Acts chapter 7. There's a lot of discussion about writing at that period and literacy at that period. And one of the things that there's no way anybody can dispute it is Moses was certainly qualified, because you'll look here in Acts chapter 7 and look at verse 22. Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. He was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians. They were the superpower of the day. They were, and of course, he was raised in the king's household. I don't know if you kind of want to think about in modern terms. He, I don't know. He got his BA at Harvard, and then he went to, or no, let's say West Point. He got his BA at West Point, and then he got his MBA at Stanford, and maybe he got one also at MIT, and then got the PhD at Harvard. However you want to picture it, that's basically the equivalent here. He would have been an exceptionally literate person, and so Moses was certainly qualified by his background and his education to write these. And then, if you look at the Pentateuch itself, there are claims from Mosaic authorship throughout that. Let's look at just a few of those. Turn over to Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17. Look down at about verse 14. Exodus 17, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." You write this down, he says, in a book. So God's telling Moses to write, and he is writing and he is recording these events. Look at chapter 24. Look at verse 4. Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with the 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is when, of course, Moses is called up there on the mountain, and he writes down all of the words of the Lord. Turn over to the book of Numbers. Hey, that's the one we're going to be in. Turn over to chapter 33. Numbers chapter 33. And look down at about verse 1 and 2. These are the journeys of the sons of Israel by which they came out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses recorded their starting places according to the journeys by the command of the Lord, and these are the journeys according to their starting places. Moses recorded these. And so throughout the Pentateuch, and we could look at more of these places, it testifies that Moses recorded this. Moses wrote this. God told Moses to write this down and all. And then, of course, as I said, the oldest Jewish traditions, the Jews have always believed that Moses was the author. And then there's the fact that, archaeology has been significant in confirming the accuracy of events and customs that were recorded in the Pentateuch to show that it could have never been written by someone who came along after. That's the claim, by the way, of those who reject Mosaic authorship. They say, it came, centuries later. There are too many details, and we can't get into all those details, but a lot of details, like the price of a slave in Joseph's life and little things like that, that people hundreds of years later would have never been able to know. And so the accuracy. So there's a lot of things like that support Mosaic authorship. Now, why would anybody question Mosaic authorship? Does anybody have any clue why anyone would even question that? Have you ever read anything or heard anything? Well, There you go. How did Moses write about his death? Now, someone could say, well, revelation. He could see before time. Well, I don't know about that, but, yeah. How could he? There's some things that just doesn't fit that Moses really wrote about, like the whole death event, or look at Numbers chapter 12. Here's another one, by the way, kind of in that same vein. Numbers chapter 12. Look at verse 3. Somebody read verse 3 for us. Anybody? You can do it out loud. There you go. Now the man Moses was very, Greg's translation said meek. Most translations say what? Humble. Moses was the humblest man on the planet. Would he have written that about himself? Moses was the humblest man on the planet. And so you have these little things throughout the book of Numbers and throughout the Pentateuch that, raise questions about Mosaic authorship. Another thing is that Moses is always referred to in the third person. It isn't right in the I. It's, he's written of as, he and Moses. And so a lot of these questions have, caused in the last couple hundred years people to discuss and debate Mosaic authorship. Here's what I'll say about that, and then if you want to ask anything, I'll gladly discuss it, or we'll move on. What I'd say about this is, first of all, let me say something about the third person, writing in the third person. That one's pretty easy to debunk. That doesn't contradict Mosaic authorship at all. In fact, we do know that that style of writing was very customary in the ancient Near East, where writers would write about, would even describe themselves in the third person. That was very common. So that's not a major thing. It's a little bit more difficult with issues like Moses' death, or Moses was the humblest person on the face of the earth. And all we can say about that is this. Look, we don't know exactly how all of the material was preserved. We don't. There are a lot of things we just can't know. How was it transmitted? Were there other sources that were used? And these are all legitimate questions, there's no doubt. But based on what we do know from the testimony of Jesus, from the testimony of the Pentateuch itself, Moses was the author. I think it's very safe to say, no, because of all of that evidence, Moses was the primary author. At the same time, he could have, as he was writing down all of these things and recording things, then there would have been some of that could have been then later on, based on what Moses wrote, brought into it. Again, the gathering, maybe sources, took Moses's notes, if you will, on some things and put them together. And so all of that stuff is a possibility. There's just too many things that we don't know. But again, the testimony of Jesus, the testimony of the Pentateuch itself, is enough to confirm that Moses is the author of it. And even if there were some points brought in where someone else, did the Moses dying addendum or whatever, one thing we do know is, and this is the most important thing, all Scripture is God-breathed. All Scripture is God-breathed. And so that's however God, used Moses in writing this. And he obviously, again, it was the primary author. But however it was done, God supervised the whole thing. And so that's the important thing. Any questions, comments, observations about the whole authorship question? All right. Well, let's talk about another big issue in the book of Numbers that has been debated and disputed for a long time as we get ready to launch into the text. Can anyone guess what a big issue, a big question mark in the book of Numbers is? Anybody at all? Okay, the why they numbered. By the way, I didn't even mention when I was talking about the name Numbers. The Hebrew calls it in the desert, so it's about the desert wanderings. We call it Numbers. Well, why do we call it Numbers? Why didn't we follow the Jewish title, in the desert? The reason we call it Numbers, the reason the Septuagint called it Numbers, was because of the two census that were taken. And the basic reason it was taken, these census, is God told him to take it. So we're going to see that in chapter 1. God said, take a census of all the fighting men. And so it wasn't like David. Remember that time David, kind of in his arrogance, and was relishing the power that he had. And so as he numbered his forces, it was a different motive. This one is nothing like that. This one was a census that was required by God. So we do know why they numbered. So, but what else? What's another? Does anybody else have a guess of what a major problem area, at least in some people's minds, of the book of Numbers is? Okay, I'll just tell you. The big numbers. The big numbers. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. They call it the number problem. As you look at the description of the children of Israel leaving Egypt, and as you look at the census here that's taken, turn over to chapter 1, and so you start to take a look. Look down in verse 46 at the number of fighting men. These are the warriors. This is the army that they could put in the field. And look at that number there. 603,550 men. You do know, right? That is a massive army. I don't know. I'm guessing that would probably be like the 5th largest in the world now. I don't know. Somebody can Google that and tell me. I'm guessing it's top 10. I don't know. I think we got about 1.5 million. Maybe less than that now, as far as our force. 603,550 warriors, fighting men. Now, remember what we're going to see when we get over to Numbers chapter 13. The spies come back from checking out the promised land, and they're terrified, right? 10 of them are terrified. Why would you be terrified if you have 603,000 man army? Because they didn't have that in Canaan. The population of Canaan wasn't 603,000 back then. And to have an army of 600. And so there's some real questions about that. They go, they look at the numbers here, and some of these numbers just don't really, in some ways, add up. If this is the fighting men, then most estimates for the number of the children of Israel who are coming out of Egyptian captivity, by the way, when you factor in everybody else, is upwards of 3 million people. 3 million people. Oh, by the way, the census was taken in one day. So there's some real issues that people have with the numbers. They say, are these legit? And so there's been a lot of attempts to kind of deal with it. One of the ways that some have suggested is a possibility is the word Eleph, the Hebrew word Eleph, which it can mean 1,000, and it's all through here, Numbers chapter 1, that word. But we also know it's a word that can also describe a clan, a group. And you'll see that in some places. Take a look at Judges chapter 6, by the way. Look at Judges chapter 6. This is where you'll see that word used. It's the same word, again, same word for thousand, but in other places it means a clan. Judges chapter 6 and look down at verse 15. When Gideon is being called by the Lord, "O Lord, how shall I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the least of Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house." My family, that's the word for thousand. My clan. We're the least. We're the least. And so you see it there. You also look at 1 Samuel chapter 10. 1 Samuel chapter 10. You'll also see it there. Look at verse 19. Saul's chosen as king here. Look at verse 19. "But you have today rejected your God who delivers you from all your calamities and your distresses. Yet you have said, 'No, but set a king over us.' Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans." And so again, the word there for clans is the same word for thousand. And so by your clans. So sometimes it can mean clan. And so one of the ways that people suggest that it might be taken to deal with the number issue there is it should be understood as clans. Sometimes that word, by the way, is mentioned in terms of leader or an official. Let me show you a place where you'll see that. Look at 1 Kings chapter 20. 1 Kings chapter 20. This is kind of an interesting one. Look at verse 30. 1 Kings chapter 20. And when you get to verse 30, this is kind of interesting. A war in war here. So it says in verse 30, "But the rest fled to Aphek into the city, and the wall fell on 27,000 men who were left. And Ben-Hadad fled and came into the city, into the inner chamber." So this wall falls down and kills 27,000 people. That's a big wall. I mean, a wall falls down and kills 27,000 people? Does anybody else have a different translation? 1 Kings chapter 20 and verse 30. Does anybody else say anything other than 27,000? Nobody? Does anybody have a footnote there? No? Everybody says 27,000. Okay. I'm surprised, but it literally, it's that word for thousand there, 27, and that Aleph, that word for thousand. But most scholars agree that no, the wall didn't fall down on 27,000 people and kill them. The wall fell down on 27, probably more likely 27 officials or leaders of the city, and were killed. And so as we're talking about the number problem, and that word can be used for different things, clans or leaders or things like that. And so that's kind of been a special problem to it. But when you get in the book of Numbers at the same time in Numbers chapter 1, that's not the only word for thousand that's used. There's also another word that literally means thousand. And so these two are kind of used interchangeably. And so that actually points to actual numbers, thousand. And so, so as you're dealing with that, how do you reconcile? How do you resolve it? I say this. I say, there are, again, so many things in terms of transmission of the text and the language, even the Hebrew scholars will tell you, we don't know everything about the language. We don't know everything. There are still some mysteries about it, and we just have to make best. There's just things we don't know. And so at the end of the day, it can, it's not an issue that should cause a lot of people to lose sleep. I don't lose any sleep over it at all. I think that the number of children of Israel who came out of Egyptian captivity it was a vast number. The numbers just don't bother me because it's really not the point of it. But a lot of people will try to undermine the integrity of Scripture by calling attention to these things. But there's just certain things. Remember, the original manuscripts that Moses wrote crumbled to dust long ago. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have a reliable text, because we certainly do. We've seen that, and we've talked about that in other classes, the transmission of the text, and we can be absolutely confident that what we have is the Word of God. Absolutely. But it doesn't do any good to pretend that some good questions don't exist on things like this, on like numbers. And there's been a lot of different solutions that have been offered to it. But I just wanted to point out, because a lot of times people will ask about the numbers, those big numbers. Paul? Yep. Yep, that's right. You can't call it a contradiction. That's exactly right. And that's what Paul said. He was, as he was teaching last one time about the addressing alleged contradictions in Scripture. And like he said, and this is absolutely true, if there are possible solutions, you can't allege a contradiction. And that's absolutely true. And this is, when you deal with numbers in Scripture, that's what you're dealing with. There's a list of possible solutions. We just don't know what they are. And so that's why even in debates that people have, skeptics, they don't usually go to issues like this. They even stay away from those, because they know that there's a list of possible solutions. And so they just stay away from those, because they can't claim a contradiction if there are possible solutions, like Paul said. Anything else? Any questions, comments, observations on that? Yes, Roger. Yep. Mm-hmm. There sure has. Yep. Yes. What Roger said, and for those who are online, he said, surely there's been math when we think about those who went down into Egypt, and then the 400 years or so spent in Egypt, and did kind of population mathematics and formulas, and what does it really come out to? Usually, it's not in the 2.5-3 million range. It's usually upward to, what I've seen is more up in the like 800,000 to a million, potentially, right? But then, Roger, there's a lot of factors that a lot of unknowns in that, and so there are. But yeah, all that has been done, and many times to try to kind of get to the root. It's just hard. Number stuff in the text can just be hard, because there's just unknowns about things, just unknowns. Anything else? All right, well, we got about 5 minutes. Let's take a look at the text. Let's just jump right in now. We're going to cover the first 10 chapters in the next 4 minutes. Now, you don't believe that, but if you'll look at the first 10 chapters, it's just a bunch of legislation. Well, okay, we won't cover the first 10 chapters, but we're just going to basically bounce over that. I will, since we just only got a couple of minutes left, I'll just point a few things out real quickly here. Well, I'll tell you what, let me start it. I do want to come back, because there are a couple of significant things as we start getting into the text here, but we won't spend a great deal of time about as we're making our way down to the narrative sections. But as Colleen mentioned a minute ago, she asked about why. You'll see that in the first few verses of chapter 1, where God instructs Moses to take a census of the people here, and only people who are 20 years old, and as I said, who is able to fight Only the fighters who were 20 and up could be counted. And verse 18 tells us it was all done at the same day. Levites were not to be counted, included in this census, but they still ended up with the number 12. And the reason they ended up with the number 12, if you look in verses 32 through 35, is that the tribe of Joseph was counted as two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so Levites were left out of the census because they're going to be set aside for God's purposes. And if you look, you start there in verse 47 of chapter 1 through verse 54, which is the rest of the chapter. You have the Levites, again, they're not included. Because of their contact with the sacred, sacred things, they couldn't be warriors. And so they were assigned the responsibility of the tabernacle and all of the furnishing. They pitched their tent around the tabernacle to protect it. I want to come back to this as we really start in the book of Numbers. And again, we won't spend a lot of time, but I think it is really significant. As I said, there's so many things to understand about the Bible as a whole. We start seeing these things right at the outset. The arrangement of the camp. God in the middle of the camp. The tabernacle in the middle of the camp. The holiness of God. The Levites there all around it to protect it, anyone from approaching it. Because if they touch it, they're dead. And so we need to talk a little bit about that, because that sets the stage for understanding the problem of sin, the issue of God's holiness, the issue of God's covenant faithfulness. All of those things we're going to see there. As you get into chapter 2 real quickly, you're going to see there's an orderly plan. Regardless of how many people actually came out, whether there's 2.5 million, 3 million, 800,000, whatever, they had to be organized. That would have been chaos. It was a significant number. And for movement, for logistics, there had to be organization. So there was, God strictly organized them on, south side, north side, west side, east side. You can read about that in chapter 2. The Levites went in the middle. You had the first group, and then you had the second group, and then you had the Levites. The Levites were always staying there in the middle, encircling the tent of meeting as they carried it. And again, we'll talk about the significance of that as we talk about God's holiness as well next week. Then we're going to get over to chapter 3. You can read about the organization of the priests. And I'll tell you, let's stop there for now. We're going to really pick up then. I want to talk as we start next week. We're going to talk about the organization of the camp and the significance of that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the organization of the priests. And that will kind of set the stage for some very important principles, theological principles. All right. Anything else before we quit, before I drop the hammer and adjourn? Well, listen, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to this study of the book of Numbers. I hope you are too. In the meantime, I hope you have a great rest of the week. And Lord willing, I'll see you Sunday. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Jenny. Jenny needs a little help. The ladies' Christmas brunch on Saturday morning, going to be back in Fellowship BNC, and she would like to have just a few men with nice, strong backs to help her move some chairs. Only need about 50 or so, some of the green chairs. And so if you can do that, where are they, Jenny? They're gray chairs. They're not green chairs. And they are, where are they at? Are they right now? Okay. Go to the fellowship hall. Guys who are going to help, go to the fellowship hall. Thank you very much. Do I? B, not A. There's a wall up between B and A now. All right. Thank y'all.